You can't walk into a store today with a dime and feel like the richest person in the room. You couldn't do it 30 years ago, and you certainly can't do it now. But for several decades in the middle of the 20th century, a child with 8 cents in their palm had genuine purchasing power, not symbolic purchasing power, actual options. The penny candy store made that possible. It didn't disappear because children stopped wanting sugar or because the candy itself got worse. It disappeared because the economics that made a 1-cent price point sustainable quietly unraveled. And the neighborhoods that gave those stores their foot traffic quietly changed shape around them. That's the real story. The bell above the door makes a thin metallic sound as you push it open, and the smell reaches you before your eyes adjust. Warm sugar, the faint chocolate edge of something unwrapped nearby, a hint of licorice threading through it all. The store is narrow. The linoleum floor has a pattern you couldn't describe if asked, worn smooth in the path from door to counter. On your left, a rack of comic books, slightly dog-eared, spines faded from weeks in the same position. On your right, the glass counter runs almost the full length of the store, and inside it, behind the slanted glass, are the jars and the trays and the rows that you've already been thinking about since you left the house. You press your nose toward the glass. The jars line the shelves behind the counter too, and each one holds something different. Root beer barrels, their amber surfaces catching the overhead light. Thin red licorice ropes coiled loosely. Tootsie Rolls in their paper twists. Mary Janes, their gold and red wrappers dense and small in the bin. Candy buttons pressed in rows on a long strip of white paper. Fireballs sitting in a jar like a pile of small red suns. The woman behind the counter looks at you not impatiently. She asks what you'd like. You hold out your hand. Maybe it's a nickel and 3 pennies, 8 cents total. And you say essentially that you have this. She doesn't rush. She walks you through the math the way a tutor might walk you through a problem, explaining that the root beer barrels are 3 for a penny, that the Mary Janes are 2 for a penny, that the wax bottles are a nickel for a whole pack. You are doing arithmetic with real stakes and a real audience. But you choose for quantity first, then for preference, then reassess, then choose again. The small brown paper bag grows heavier as she counts items out loud, folding the top once when you've spent the last cent. The bag is light but makes a dry rustling sound when you take it. Outside, the door swings shut behind you, the bell sounds once more, and the negotiation is over. The whole interaction took maybe 4 minutes. You knew everyone in that store. They knew where you lived. The corner candy store in its classic form was a family operation. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia through the 1940s and 1950s, these stores were typically storefronts, with the owners living directly above or behind the selling floor. In Brooklyn alone, during the early 20th century, nearly every block carried one. Across the boroughs of New York City, hundreds of these shops operated simultaneously, many run by immigrant families, Jewish, Italian, Greek, who used the candy counter as an anchor for a broader operation that might include a soda fountain, a newspaper rack, a tobacco section, or a telephone that neighborhood residents paid a nickel to use. The transaction protocol was specific and well understood. Children came alone or in small groups after school, carrying whatever coins they'd accumulated from chores, or change returned from grocery errands. They pointed and selected piece by piece, and then the owner or a family member counted aloud, kept a running total, and filled the bag. There was no self-service. There was no checkout line. The entire exchange required the owner's direct participation. In smaller towns, the same function was served by the general store's candy counter, a glass case near the register, accessible to kids who walked from surrounding blocks or nearby farms. The geography differed, but the ritual was the same. You arrived with a specific amount. You left with as much as that amount could buy. Some stores kept informal records for trusted young customers. During lean stretches, a Depression-era habit that persisted quietly, an owner might note an IOU in a small notebook and let a regular kid take candy home against the certainty that he'd return with coins next week. That wasn't charity. That was community credit operating outside any formal system. The penny price point held because every component of the system supported it. American sugar prices remained low and federally stabilized through the mid-20th century. Industrial candy manufacturing had been improving since the 1890s, when Austrian immigrant Leo Hirschfeld invented the Tootsie roll in 1896, the first individually wrapped penny candy, and brought consistent, portable, shelf-stable confections into the market at volume. By the 1920s, an estimated 100,000 varieties of candy products were available from small manufacturers across the country, most priced to match what a child's pocket change could reach. For the store owner, penny candy wasn't the profit center. It was the traffic engine. A child who came in for candy, stayed to look at comics, bought a soda, came back the next day. By 1959, U.S. candy sales hit a record $1.16 billion, a market that depended heavily on impulse purchases at small, accessible locations close to where children actually lived and walked. The candy itself cost the retailer fractions of a cent to stock, and the markup, though modest per piece, compounded quickly across dozens of small daily transactions. The system worked because the neighborhood was dense, the candy was cheap to produce, the children were mobile on foot, and the stores were convenient enough to serve as a daily stop rather than a special trip. Then four things happened that unraveled it. The first was a single, catastrophic cost spike. In 1973, sugar cost roughly 90 cents per pound in the United States. By November 1974, that price had risen to 580 cents per pound, a 544% increase driven by crop shortages, global demand spikes, and speculative buying. Overnight, the economics of penny candy collapsed. A candy bar that had held at a nickel through most of the 1960s jumped to a dime in 1974 and then kept climbing. By 1976, the New York Times was reporting candy bar prices rising to 20 cents. By the late 1970s, 50 cents was common, and the penny price point, the foundational logic of the entire store model, was gone and never returned. The second force was geographic. American suburbanization, accelerating through the 1950s and peaking through the 1960s and 1970s, steadily dismantled the neighborhood density that penny candy stores required. When families moved from urban blocks to suburban subdivisions, the walkable radius that let a child travel alone to a corner store shrank or disappeared entirely. A store that relied on children arriving independently on foot could not survive in a landscape designed around the family automobile. Strip malls and supermarkets placed their candy sections near checkout registers, not near front doors, and the act of buying candy became attached to an adult errand rather than a child's independent outing. The third force was regulatory. Zoning laws, modernized through the post-war decades, increasingly separated commercial and residential land use in ways that hadn't always been enforced in older urban neighborhoods. In many cities, when a corner candy store closed, the space couldn't legally be replaced by a new retail operation. The zoning had changed around the building. The store became a residence, or simply sat vacant. Each closure became permanent in ways that earlier eras hadn't required. The fourth force was supermarket competition. In 1966, the candy section of a typical American supermarket was a compact rack near the checkout, a minor afterthought. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as consumer packaged goods companies expanded their retail reach, grocery stores built out dedicated candy aisles with prepackaged bags, multi-bar boxes, and variety packs priced per pound rather than per piece. The same amount of candy that once required a trip to a specialized store, chosen item by item, could now be dropped into a cart as part of a weekly grocery run. Convenience had shifted entirely. The shift didn't announce itself. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, candy stores that survived simply raised their prices, first to 2 cents per piece, then 5. The glass jars stayed. The counter stayed. The owner stayed. But the math that had made a child's coins feel substantial no longer worked. A dime bought 2 pieces instead of 10. The calculation that made the penny candy store feel different from every other retail experience, the experience of abundance from scarcity, of making sophisticated choices with a small budget, required that the unit price stay low enough for pennies to matter. Once it didn't, the store became just another small shop selling candy at prices available anywhere. By the early 1970s, many storefronts that had served as candy stores for decades were closing, and the surviving ones tended to cluster in the densest urban neighborhoods, where foot traffic and neighborhood loyalty carried them past the point where economics alone would have forced closure. Economy Candy on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, founded in 1937, operated through all of it and still operates today. But places like it became notable precisely because they persisted. Exceptions worth documenting rather than an ordinary feature of any neighborhood. But it wasn't just inflation and zoning. What disappeared wasn't just cheap candy. It was a specific form of economic education that happened informally, inside a store, guided by an adult who had no particular stake in what you chose. When you stood at that glass counter with 8 cents, you were performing real budget management. You were making trade-offs, quantity versus quality, variety versus value, with actual consequences. You were also being trusted. A 6-year-old sent alone to a candy store 2 doors down was operating in a world that acknowledged their limited but genuine competence. The store owner who walked you through the math wasn't condescending. They were treating your 8 cents as a real transaction deserving real attention. What also disappeared was the owner's particular knowledge of the neighborhood's children. Which kids had money today? Which ones had spent theirs already? Which one deserved a small grace on a slow Tuesday? That kind of informal social intelligence doesn't transfer to a candy aisle in a supermarket, and it probably shouldn't be romanticized too heavily. But it was real, and it was part of what made the corner store something other than a retail outlet. What the penny candy store's decline reflects is a shift in who the primary actor in retail is understood to be. For most of commercial history, a store was a place where 2 people engaged in an exchange. The buyer stated what they had and what they wanted, and the seller guided them toward the best available match. Self-service retail, which expanded steadily from the 1950s forward, relocated the decision-making entirely into the buyer's hands. That shift produced enormous efficiency, genuine cost savings, and access to variety that earlier models couldn't approach. It also eliminated the specific social texture of a transaction involving a knowledgeable person on both sides of the counter. Whether that texture was worth preserving isn't a question with a clean answer. The penny candy store's economics made it dependent on conditions, cheap sugar, dense neighborhoods, children walking alone, that changed for reasons that had nothing to do with candy. The weight of 8 cents in your palm, the sound of the doorbell, the faint chocolate smell of a room full of open jars. Those were specific sensory facts that belonged to a specific set of economic and geographic conditions. When those conditions changed, the experience changed with them. That was probably inevitable. If you remember counting your pennies on a glass counter, while someone patient walked you through the choices, that memory has some history behind it now. A like on this video helps more people find that history. And if the store in your town was different name, different candy, different owner, leave that in the comments. That's the part no archive has. That's the part only you know. Subscribe if you'd like to keep following where these ordinary disappearances lead. The glass jars are still out there, in a few places. The math, though, that's gone.